Speaking of that, let's get to the Atlantic Division and Minnesota Timberwolves making a trade before the preseason even started. And that's Karl-Anthony Towns for Julius Randle, as we've talked about. But we never got you guys' thoughts on the actual trade for New York and Minnesota, how that looks on each side. So, Kyle, your initial thoughts, and maybe even after seeing Karl-Anthony Towns a little bit with the Knicks in the preseason, what your thoughts have been since.
So, his recent performances in the preseason notwithstanding, I'm still surprised they did it when they did, because it does feel like they have now, this is the team, right? It's going to be very difficult, even if they want to at some point, to break this team up. You're just pot committed. You don't have a lot of picks to attach to guys. You have a lot of guys on big money contracts, including a couple in Towns and Anunoby specifically that I think are like, that could get dicey, right? Because OG's rarely healthy for a full season. Towns has his health concerns in addition to some defensive issues. I do think if he plays to his offensive ceiling, and that comes and goes from time to time, it has materially raised their ceiling as a team, because yes. I think the ability to play 5 out and have a guy who frankly is really comfortable and confident in that spot up role in the way Towns is, that might change the dynamic of their offense, right? It's a lot harder to defend them with Towns constantly lurking around the 3-point line, able to get up, 7-8 threes and make 40% of those, with Brunson's ability to score, with Mikhail's ability to slash, with OG's ability to, pick on some mismatches here and there. Like, I think he makes a big difference in that way. My worry would be he has never been a consistently good enough defender as a pure big man, as a true center. And can you make up for that with Mikhail and OG? That's about as good of a combination as you can have on the wing to try to account for it. But my worry would be that Twin Towers thing ended up working out brilliantly for him, because he was able to lean into his offensive firepower and what he's able to do while having Rudy Gobert to protect him a lot of the time and be the final line of defense, the rim protector that Minnesota needed. And now that he doesn't have that, I just wonder what that looks like for him, what that looks like for the Knicks. And beyond that, how much you change the identity of the team by putting Cat there, and maybe now you're less of a aggressive offensive rebounding team, and maybe now you're a little bit less of that stingy defensive team. Like, how much do you compromise what you were great at in order to improve your ability to score on the other end of the floor? So I think it's a really interesting trade for the Knicks. I am not really prepared to say anybody won that trade. I think there are some downfalls for both teams and some upside for both teams, but it's interesting at the very least.
Yeah, I think this is one of the more interesting thought experiments that we get to see play out among recent trades, because it's not truly obvious. I think Minnesota got the best player, and I think pretty clearly. And I know there's some people, Winona in the chat.
Minnesota
earlier,
got the best player?
No, I'm sorry, New York.
Oh, okay.
I was going to say, boy, I didn't know you were a Julius Randle guy.
But there's some, Winona in the chat was saying, well, you can't count on Cat. Well, I don't know if you looked up Julius Randle's playoff stats.
Oh, they are ghastly.
He's shooting 34% from the field and 28% from 3 in 15 playoff games. He is not reliable in the playoffs at all. So I think they got the best player, and I think they did increase their overall ceiling. But, and I do think, generally speaking, I do not like Cat as a 5, period, point blank. He's just not a good enough team defender. His rotations aren't there. His communication's not there. He's not a physical enough defender. He doesn't protect them. There's all kinds of reasons I don't like him. But if you were going to say what's the perfect environment for him to not succeed defensively at the 5, because you'll never succeed defensively.
Tread water.
But to not be as damaging, it would be in a squad like New York, where they have big wings who can switch almost everything and limit his responsibility defensively. And if that happens, and look, I think like there's some question like, well, is Joel Embiid going to defend Cat? No, I think in that series, Joel Embiid defends Josh Hart, and you just hope he doesn't shoot 45% from three again, because you can get away putting a wing, someone like Caleb Martin on Cat. He's not really going to bully him in the post. He still wants to be on the perimeter, and Cat can still be useful in that regard, right? Like he is a much more connective piece. First of all, he's a better offensive player than Randle, puts up similar numbers, but way more efficient, and he doesn't stop the ball movement nearly as much. His shooting's good enough that he legitimately spaces the floor, and the ball moves a lot better with him on it. I think he's going to make each player's job on New York easier offensively. The question is, can they keep that defensive identity? Can they keep that identity as a rebounder? And do they have enough depth? Because when you make a 2-for-1 trade like this and two core key pieces in your rotation, well, now you're shorter. You have a team that is frequently injured and with a lot of injury-prone guys. Is that upgrade offensively enough to counteract that depth and that defensive downgrade? And we'll see. Like I said, it's one of the more interesting thought experiments that we've seen. Because, I think Cat is supremely talented. I think he's more talented than Julius Randle. And frankly, I trust him a little more in the playoffs. But that's not really because I fully bought into Cat as a playoff performer. Just the other guy has been really, really bad. But there are certainly some downsides. I think from Minnesota's viewpoint, and the question isn't just like, can New York overcome those concerns, but also, was this the best move to make with that big expiring contract in Randle? Because like you said, they're a little pot committed at this point. From Minnesota's viewpoint, first of all, they saved money, and that's a huge portion of this deal. That's a huge, huge portion. And hopefully they got a guy in Donte who can be a long-term role player at a relatively fixed cost. Yeah. So you're getting rid of one bad contract. You're getting you're not getting the best player, and the headliner, so to speak, that you got probably isn't a long-term part of your plans, but maybe you got a role player that you think you can slot in. I think that's probably their philosophy, not like a short. I don't think this year they're better.
Well, the Sixers play the Knicks, the 10th game of the season, and that's going to be an interesting one. It's part of the start of the NBA midseason tournament, and they are in the same group as the New York Knicks, so we get to see them very early in the 10th game of the season as the Sixers and the Knicks will face off here in Philadelphia.
And I have one more out of this whole trade that I think has maybe flown under the radar. And this is something we talked about way back when we talked about Anunoby as a trade target. Are we sure just because they gave him all the money that he's going to be happy at where he's at in the pecking order here? Because everything that we heard, and I've talked to some people even recently after this Cat trade that would know, was OG wants to be a featured guy to some extent, right? Like wanted more opportunities. And that was one of the friction points in Toronto. It was something, there were, I won't say issues last year when he was in New York, but certainly he wanted to be involved on the ball. And I think part of his signing that contract was looking at the landscape and saying, okay, McHale's coming in, but also I can be like a third option type guy on this team. Now you're like a very clear fourth option. And, money can do a lot of things and push this off to the side for a while. But if you get halfway into the season and OG is grumbling about like, well, I didn't get this, I didn't get that. Yeah, I'm scoring 10 to 12 points a few nights a week. It's like, I don't know, that's a potential friction point for that team that I'm interested to follow. So not to say that that's not a reason to do the deal, right? I think Cat, for all the reasons that we already laid out, is still a worthwhile gamble, but just something to keep an eye on up there in New York.
Should be an interesting one. Do either of you believe real fast that they have now, if you had the Sixers just in front of them, do you think this puts them right back in front of the Sixers, or are the Sixers still right there? Because when we looked at the numbers, what was it, 52? Knicks were still 52.5 win total. The Sixers were 51.5, according to Bet365. Does that change anything for either of you?
I don't know. Tell me who's healthy.
Yeah, I think it's very dependent on who emerges in April, May with most, if not all, their roster intact, because between Cat and OG and between Joel and Paul, those are four core guys between those two teams that you're like, you really got to cross your fingers that they don't run into any health issues at the end of the year.
Yeah, absolutely.
We all silly like the mayor.